So, anyway, i-skip na lang natin yung James 24. It's only like, is finding a wife for Isaac. And then,
Ikaw nagsuggest, bigay ko sa kanya to.
Abraham. So, 26, 27 would be the story of Isaac, Rebecca, Isaac, and Jacob. So, and then, let's begin sa likod. There's a link of Jocelyn. No. Sa likod, may tao. Jocelyn, pakibasa mo.
Isaac, Rebecca, Esau, and Jacob. Jacob's history is filled with deceit and trickery. Jacob used people and events to his own advantage.
Okay. Jacob used people and events to his own advantage. And this is not how God wants us and do. Because God loves people and use things. Although kabaliktaran kadalasan yung ginagawa ng tao. Sometimes, or magalas na natin sa ating sila yung mga amo. They use people and value things. Yeah. Okay. And hopefully, hindi tayo ganun. Okay?
By God's grace po na.
Now, we look for value of people kasi people are eternal. Things, they only more. Yeah, there's this thing, there are things that can be used, but not to be valued more than people. Right? So, although sometimes it's easily said and done, kasi sometimes things have sentimental values para sa atin. Mayroon tayong bagong kasama.
Sit-in po siya. Pinaalam po namin kay Ma'am Joyce last week. Okay lang daw po na mag-sit-in muna.
Okay.
She's from Yunlong
Baptist.
yung Kaulong Philippine Baptist Church, Yunlong branch.
Kayo ni Ate Joanne doon?
Si Joanne Trabo, si Ate Freda.
Ano pangalan mo?
Ako nga pala si Jenny Asmin from Baguio.
Jenny. Welcome, Jenny. Thank you for glad na you can have even join. Mayroon din ibang taga-Bagyo dito, si Abel, taga-Bagyo. Sino pang taga-Bagyo? Si Ben, taga-Bagyo din.
Si Ate Sam din.
Si Sam.
So, okay, anyway, ang inaaral namin ay Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So, we're now going through the book of Genesis. Ito ay lesson 3 sa aming sa book. Okay? So, anytime na magtanong o gusto mo linawin ng mga bagay-bagay, maraming sasagot sa iyo. Handin niyo sila. Okay? Just feel free. Okay, like ate. Okay. Pakibasa ang Genesis 25. You will use your phone.
Wag ma'am, ka mag-Facebook records ma'am.
Yan ang 25, 27, 24.
Don't. Bobby.
27 to 30.
Pinanunguhan yung naging ko. And the boy is a group up. Sige. Ben?
Okay. Sabi po dito sa 27, the boys grew up and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was a quiet man, staying among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste of wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I am famished." That is why he was called Edom. Jacob replied, "First sell me your birthright." "Look, I am about to die," Esau said. "What good is that birthright to me?" But Jacob said, Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank. and then he got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright.
All right, thank you. So anyway, ang question dito is, was Jacob, what Jacob did was legally right. But do you think it was morally right? Answer your, no. Explain your answer. Okay. Yeah. What do you think? Happy birthday to you.
Awesome. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, happy birthday. Happy birthday to you.
Mamaya na lang, man.
Lapit lang ang Jollibee na.
Kami, habol na lang kami, habol na lang kami. Ma'am, take out na lang sa akin.
Hindi, ibubook namin yun.
Oh, wow. Sa corner.
Joke.
68 lang naman ako. Oh.
Kasi maghahabol kami sa 8. Maghahabol kami sa 8.
Wow.
Oo, kahit iwanan namin kayo doon.
Saan dito? 68. Saan ma'am?
Jollibee. Sa Jollibee dito.
I-google mo na lang, Google.
Hindi ko magkapunta, hindi mo alam.
Kasi pwede na natin mabasa.
Okay, ma'am. So, sunod kami doon.
No.
Wala choice, di ba? Kasi sinasabi ko.
Okay. So, yeah. So, yes. Yeah. Can I read my answer? Okay. Jacob take advantage of his brother when he was hungry and manipulated his birthright. Okay. It was not even legally right or morally right because they were brothers. He has to keep him without any. Alright. Okay. So, 57. Yeah, 57. So yeah, it wasn't morally right, but the other person agreed. Okay.
So it's legal.
He can really value that birthright because he is the first one. Remember? So that was his
Dapat panghawakan.
already by right, like being the firstborn son.
Di ba kapag meron kang gusto, you will take the advantages para makuha mo yung minimiti mo. At yung opportunity, dumating. So, para kay Jacob, na gusto niyang inaasa-masa, dahil never na maging panganay siya,
Yeah, yun na yung place kasi niya.
dahil forever na siya. So, as culturally, pwede mong i-exchange
Oo.
with the consent ng panganay. So, in a sense, dapat yung isang tao, ipangangalagahan niya. Kung ayaw niya, huwag niya dapat ibenta. So, he also make a consent, they make an equal. So, I mean, I will take my advantages para doon. Otherwise, I won't be having that birth, right?
Pero if you would look at it, it's not a fair exchange.
Yeah. Parang sobra-sobra yung hiningi.
Mamamatay na nga, di ba? Sabi ko.
Kasalanan niya kasi nagpagutom siya.
Dati na pinili naman ng Panginoon na mauna si Iso, maging panganay, pero they couldn't take it parang inagaw sa ito. Kaya hindi sa akin parang moral. But did you know that when they were still inside the tummy,
Oo, foretold na naman.
The younger.
Diba? Mayroon ng prophecy tungkol.
The younger were served. The younger brother.
The older, the younger.
Yeah, but then he already knew that, but then he was trying to find his own way, his own means to make that happen.
Yeah. He ran ahead of what God's plan for him. And it's morally, it is not morally right because asan yung love mo as a brother? Di ba?
And somehow, if he could have waited, it probably was his anyway. It could have been given to him.
Yeah.
Hindi siya nagkaroon ng ano.
Yeah, God would orchestrate the means
Situation.
At saka sinabi rin ng Diyos na wala pa namang ginagawa si Esau at si Jacob. Jacob I love, and Esau I hate. So there's already
Siguro mo, if Jacob just waited, then yung hardship na dinanas niya, hindi niya dadanasin. Nung umalis siya because of Esau's anger. Yeah.
Anyway, parang tayo,
Tayo din. Ako din.
parang tayo, okay, right? Got it.
Pero kung binalyo ni Esau yung birthright niya,
Hindi pa rin
Hindi-
mapupunta
hindi
sa
siya-
kanya.
hindi yun hindi yun nawawala sa kanya.
Gugit ng palad eh.
Oh,
Because-
wala tayo sa
But then again, we see there na he didn't really value it. So,
Like, they didn't value it. Kasi binigyan lang niya ng for the sake of food. For the sake of food.
Yeah. But how often na
Yeah.
we exchange something very valuable for temporal things
Yeah.
in life. So, para bang siguro, ulan tayo na parang agay, she gave up so much.
Yeah. For the sake of food.
Well, that's
He desired the fruit of knowledge, knowing that she has already the knowledge of God because God created her.
So, yeah. Okay, so, yeah. Anyway, let's move on now to Jacob and Joseph, the Genesis. This actually covers the whole life, the whole rest of Genesis. So, sino yung patriarchs natin?
Abraham,
Isaac, Jacob,
Joseph.
Okay, so usually when the Old Testament would refer like your father Abraham or the promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, usually it refers to these people. Kaya tinatawag silang their parents. So, in Genesis 28, 10 to 22, what were the promises God made to Jacob? Remember, actually, at this time, he did not really know God yet, personally. He didn't have an encounter with God yet. In all of this. So, now he's on the run.
I'm giving you this land that you are lying.
Okay, can you read it like that for everyone, please?
Okay, I will put it on. Behold, I am with you and keep you wherever you go and bring back out this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised.
Kunong kasi na naging, yeah.
Yung nakaupo. Doon na siya nakalagit na natulog siya sa bato.
Mayroon pa na ulit sa buong ano.
I am yung 10 to 22. Then Jacob departed from Beersheba and went toward Haran. He came to a certain place and spent the night there, because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of the place and put it under his head and lay down in the place.
Dream na siya dyan.
He had dreamed, and behold, the ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching to heaven. Behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood up above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the land which you lie. I will give you to you and to your descendants.
Amen.
Your descendants will also be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and the east, and to the north and to the south. And in you and your descendants shall all the families of the earth will be blessed. Behold, I am with you and with you wherever you go, and bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I promised. And Jacob awoke and from the sleep said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? None other than the house of God, and this is the place. This is the gate of heaven.
Amen.
Okay, that was the first encounter.
Yes,
that he had.
yes.
Okay, that was his first encounter. And he promised that God has, for Abraham, ngayon nandugan naman sa kanya, the land and the descendants. Okay, inulit doon sa kanya. Right? So, and then,
Continuous yung promise ni God kay Abraham. Continuous na kasi from Abraham to
hanggang sa Abraham.
sa Africa.
So, the blessing doon na pinamis ni God, dire-diretso hanggang sa
Promise father.
Pinasa
Promise
in a form.
lolo. It's
yeah,
Abraham.
the grandfather niya, diba, si Abraham.
Yes.
But now it's being passed to him.
Yeah.
Okay? So, yeah. So, makita natin yan actually na how the faith of parents affects the children.
Amen.
So, even sometimes you never know your obedience now, your faith now. Maybe life is so difficult when you look at your children.
Amen.
But along the line, generations to come, you've already planted a seed of faith and obedience. Amen. And that will really carry through. Amen. You just do not know. But there is already the seed, and it's only a matter of time that it will multiply, it will grow, and it will
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Praise God.
So what was Jacob's response to God's revelation to himself? Of himself and to his promise. Remember, at this time he was running away and he knew that he did something wrong.
He made a vow. He made a vow.
He was fearful.
I mean, he was just running for his life. He knew that he just cheated his brother, not only the birthright, but also the
His
blessing.
father.
He also cheated his father. Also cheated his father because he blinded him. Okay? What was his response? We should answer it.
He made a condition sa Panginoon.
He made a vow. Jacob a vow.
Nakipag-condition sa Panginoon.
What was the condition?
Di ba sabi po niya doon sa sa verse,
The verse 20. Sabi niya, Jacob a
Yeah.
vow.
if siya doon. If God will be with me and will watch over me on my journey I'm taking and will give me food to eat, clothes to wear, so I will return safely to my father's house. There the Lord will be my God. Gagawin ko siya yung God ko, and then I will give a tenth of my everything. Parang sabi ko.
So, nakita natin ano, kasi that was his first encounter. Akala niya na pwede mag-bargain, magpag-anuhan ng business. That's his way of thinking. That's his life. His life has always been a bargain to him. And usually, mas siya ang nakakalamang sa bargaining. Siya ang mas masunod sa ano yung kanyang gustong arrangement. And remember, sometimes, kung bago pa tayo Kristiyano, ganun naman tayo. Ay, nasabi ko mga panalangin. We think that God has to listen to how we want things done, how we want to go about it. Diba? Ganun din siya. Kasi this is only his initial experience, initial encounter with God. Okay, so, and his life is always like bargaining, but taking advantage. Okay? But, hindi naman siya nireject ni God dito. Wait a minute. Bakit ikaw masunod? Okay, so no. Yeah, okay. So yeah, and then also actually he has some unfinished business. He still have some issues na he was running away from. Okay, and then actually even though he was away from people from Esau, okay, but he actually was carrying with him his issues in his heart. It has not changed. It has not made the situation better. Dahil lang siya lumayo, it did not mean na resolve na yung kanyang issue. Kanyang problema. Yeah, it was actually carrying it with him.
At saka isa pang issue is, he was so tired to the long journey. Yung down ng kanyang pagtatakbo for running and trying to sleep with all of that heaviness sa kanya away from his favorite mother and all of these things. God came for him and revealed blessing. I mean, what a good benefit for him. And yet, he still, talaga, Diyos, kung talaga sige nga, bibigyan ko ito. May porsyento ka sa akin.
So makita ninyo, talagang it's, kailangan, hindi siya inano ni God, hindi siya talaga
Ni-review ko.
Kasi para sa akin, dahil hindi siya nire-review ni God, unang-una, parang mayroong doon, yung tatay nila, kasi may favoritism, sana dalawa sila, paborito niya si Iso, yung si Isa, paborito niya kasi si Iso, kasi mag-sales talaga si Jacob, doon yung sa tatay. Kung ba doon nagsimula yung ni Jacob na, yung division ng dalawang magkapatid, dapat, di ba pag-ama, dapat pareho ang pagtingin mo sa anak, pero nakikita naman na sabi daw dito na, si Isa, mas mahal na talaga si Iso, paborito niya. Kaya si Jacob, hindi natin
Hindi rin natin masasabi no kasi as a culturally, panganay ang magkakaroon ng double blessings. Well, it's one of those dahil sa pagkain, pero ang isang main doon, di panganay dapat. So he's doing the tradition as a kanya. At ang problema sa kanya, matagal pa kaya buhay niya. Nag-conclude na siya.
Hindi na natin masasabi.
Matagal pa kaya naging buhay niya.
Kasi dyan ang nagsimula kasi yung PS na kasi parang nagkaroon ng paborito. But in fact, actually, nung nandun pa nga sa tiyan, sinabi niya ng Panginoon, and Jacob, Isaac would have known that. The God has already applied for his sons, for the twins. God has already, but then, divided sila mag-asawa. Divided sila. They could have talk to each other and said, how are we going to go about this?
Kasi hindi nag-submit si Rebecca.
Diba? And then, ganito naman itong sitwasyon. You know what I mean? Bilang mag-asawa, bilang parents, they could have really discussed. But then, again, kung hindi natin balikan ang kanilang dating. It was really dating. They don't really have time to get to know each other. Okay. Kasi dumating na lang si Rebecca, because she has really good qualities. But in terms of the communication to develop with them, to have openness, kasi it could have been really resolved if they communicated.
Pero may 20 years naman po silang bonding. Kasi 20 years pa naman hindi sila nagkaanak. So at least may na-build sana na at least communication sa kanila.
Pero hindi isa naman yung getting to know each other.
No, because
Answer prayer, Master Vika.
Jake,
Yeah, even to answer prayer. Yeah, it's really to answer prayer. There's so many things.
Rose, sige, take that one, Rose. Take that one.
That's prayer.
Nandiyan ako na.
But there is still work that needs to be done in between to make married life or family life work. Amen. Kahit kasi simula-simula, alam talaga ninyo, nag-work for each other. It's still a long way. It's a process to journey wherein makaayos ang relasyon. Amen.
Siya,
So, ang ano talaga doon is communication doon sa kanilang mag-asawa. That's something na there was some kind of a problem doon.
I think Isaac also failed to get the respect of Rebecca. Hindi nagsubmit si Rebecca sa kanya.
Regarding sa communication, kasi yung culture nila, parang
pag babae, hindi ka naman nila kilala, wala ka. Pag basta pinagtatulong kayo, wala kasing karapatan ang babae. Sa lalaki na sabihin mo na ganito. Ikaw at babae.
Housewife and home girl.
Kaya yung sinasabi ko, kaya nga yung asawa niya sa kasi hindi niya pwede i-suggest kung ano yung ano ng lalaki, kung ano yung decision, hindi ka pwede makialam. Kasi yung lalaki na lang. According to sa ano lang.
Totoo naman talaga yun sa ano na yun.
Kasi yun yung aking amo ko gano'n eh. Amo ko yung kahit gusto ng babae na ano, pati make-up niya, hindi niya siya mapapag-design. Bali ba lalaki naman?
So with what you're saying, it would be possible that Rebecca is doing the will of God. It became embarrassing.
Kailangan kasi surrender ka na.
Unintentionally.
Yeah. Anyway, we know that something is not right along the line. Okay? We're not saying that Rebecca is right or Rebecca is wrong or Isaac is right. But we just know that it's not really how God would have wanted it done and would have accomplished it if they really put the Lord as the Lord of both their lives. Like even family lives right now, you're if you are married, you have a husband, you're a wife. There's a lot of misunderstanding. There's a lot of conflict. And I can tell you my own life dahil ibang lahi yung asawa ko. And then, kahit na the way we look at things, the way we communicate, the way we desire things, gusto ko talaga kainin kanin, siya puro tinapay. And then mag-quote ako ng verse of Matthew na alone. But it's nice also. But my point is, what brings us together is kahit na sa kadami-daming potential conflict, we come to God in prayer.
Amen.
And we let Him, whatever God says, and in principle, okay? Although, sometimes I don't really agree. Hindi naman na. Kung puro na lang ako agree, hindi na ako kailangan doon. Okay? I'm a different person too, different individual, different personality. I don't always agree. But, being a wife, I have to learn to submit. And I have to learn to trust God sa decision na ginawa niya. Okay? So yun ang just to let you know. Yun ang, I want to realize my place. Okay? And then pray for him sa decision na hindi ako sang-ayon. Okay? Dahil hindi ko naman tuloy, say, decision mo yan, hindi rin makakatulong. But kung whatever yung decision na hindi ako sang-ayon, I would submit willingly, and then pray na that decision is what God wants. And kung hindi, then we both can learn from it. Kahit na kung mali na ang decision.
Ladies, pakinggan nyo yan, ha?
Anyway, yeah, we know. Communication, okay? Communication is important.
Acknowledge
So, records.
What? Sabi talaga ni Kuya Agul, pakinggan daw kasi siya nag-iisa.
Kahit pangalan dito, pinicturean ko na.
First one. Can someone read it? Yung first one, hindi ko rin siya mapano. Hindi ko how much I tried na maging Joseph's brothers selling into slavery and become a servant of Potiphar. Yeah, Joseph. Ito, second,
Joseph becomes Potiphar's
steward and servant.
Entrusted
Servant, but Potiphar's
Potiphar's
wife
falsely accused him of attempted rape.
All right, okay. And then
Joseph
Joseph
is thrown into the prison
where he
comes to Pharaoh's attention because he interpreted dreams.
Okay, next.
Joseph wins Pharaoh's confidence by giving him
good advice about an approaching
Lakas ng mata nyo.
Joseph becomes second.
Hindi ko
Kita niya
makita.
binasa sa libro.
Oo nga. Hindi ko makita. Sige,
Joseph contract with his family and moved to Egypt. Okay, so this is the key event in Joseph's life, right?
Okay.
Uh,
Video natin. Sige.
and you will see here.
Tapos na tayo sa ano, ma'am?
Part pa rin ito ng ano natin, kay Joseph, ito yung pinakalas sa chapter 3.
And Jacob ba?
Bago mo ito tapos na kay Jacob.
Oo, yung blessings na dineclare niya sa, na blessings ba? Kinonfirm na
Noon ni God, nung na-encounter ni Jacob si God, binalian siya sa,
Yung the second time,
Oh,
that was
second
yung
time.
second encounter after 20 years, di
yeah,
ba?
that's why his name was changed.
So,
Kasi
Israel.
hindi niya bibitawan si God unless i-bless siya. So the blessings become, kasi talagang binibless siya ni God para lang bitawan siya kasi mag-uumaga.
So that was the second encounter. Thanks for mentioning that one. That was the second encounter. And then, actually, from the first encounter to the second encounter, Jacob experienced a lot of hardship. Oo.
Ito?
30-50 tayo. Oo, 30-50.
The book of Genesis. In the first video, we saw how chapters 1 through 11 set up the basic storyline of the Bible. God has created all things, and he makes humans in his image to rule the world on his behalf. The humans choose sin and rebellion, and so the world spins out of control into violence and death, all leading up to the rebellion and scattering of the people in Babylon. And so the big question is, what is God going to do to rescue and redeem his world? Well, out of that scattering at Babylon, the author traces a genealogy of just one family that leads eventually to a man named Abram, later known as Abraham. And God's promise to Abraham at the beginning of chapter 12 opens up a whole new movement in the story. God calls Abraham to leave his home and go to the land of Canaan, which God says will become his one day. And in that land, God promises to make Abraham into a great nation, to make his name great and to bless him. Now, these promises are connected back to earlier parts of the book. So Babylon had arrogantly tried to make a great name for itself. That didn't go over very well. But God, in his generosity, is going to bestow a great name on this no-name guy, Abraham. And God's blessing of Abraham echoes all the way back to that original blessing God gave humanity in the beginning. So the question is, why is God going to bless Abraham and his family? And the last line of God's promise makes this clear. So that all the families of the earth will find God's blessing in you. Now, this is key for understanding the whole rest of the biblical story. God's plan is to rescue and bless his rebellious world through Abraham's family. And this is why the whole rest of the Old Testament story is just going to focus on this one family, eventually called the people of Israel. This is also why Israel will later be called a kingdom of priests at Mount Sinai. God wants to use them to show all of the other nations what he's like. And ultimately, this is the promise that gets picked up by the later biblical prophets and poets who say that its fulfillment will come through Israel's messianic king, whose reign will bring justice and peace to all of the nations. Now, at this point of the story, none of that's clear. You just have to keep reading and watch the promise develop. And so the rest of the book focuses on Abraham and his family. First, Abraham himself, then his son Isaac, and then his son Jacob, and then Jacob's 12 sons. And the stories about each generation, they're united by two main themes. So first, each generation of Abraham's family is marked by repeated failure. They just keep making really bad decisions that mess up their lives and put God's promise in jeopardy. However, God remains faithful to them. He keeps rescuing them from themselves and reaffirming his commitment to bless them and bless the nations through them despite their failings. So the Abraham stories. God had promised Abraham a huge family, but on two different occasions, he's afraid for his life because other men are attracted to his wife, and so he denies that he's even married to her, which creates, of course, all of these problems. And not only that, Abraham and his wife Sarah, they can't have children, and so Sarah arranges for Abraham to sleep with one of their servant girls, which also creates all of these problems in the family. But each time, God bails Abraham out. And in chapters 15 and 17, God even formalizes his promise to Abraham with an official commitment called the covenant. This is a classic scene. God invites Abraham to look up at the night stars and to count them. And he says, that's how numerous your family is going to be. And despite all of the odds, having no kids and no way to have any at the moment, Abraham looks up in the sky and simply trusts God's promise. And God responds by entering into a covenant with Abraham, promising that he will become a father of many nations, that God's blessing may come to the whole world. God asks Abraham to mark his family with a sign of the covenant, circumcision of all the male boys in the family. This is a symbol to remind them that the fruitfulness of their family is a gift from God. And so Abraham has lots of kids eventually, and he dies at a good old age. Now the Jacob stories play out these themes even more dramatically. From birth, Jacob lives up to the meaning of his name, which is deceiver. He cheats his brother Esau out of his inheritance and blessing, and he does it by deceiving his old blind father, no less, and then he just takes off. He goes on to take 4 wives, even though he really only loves one, Rachel, and this creates all of these rivalries in the family. The only thing that humbles Jacob is being deceived by his uncle Laban, who cheats him out of years of his life. The tables have finally turned. And so it's a humbled Jacob that returns to his homeland. And in a very strange story, Jacob ends up wrestling with God as he demands that God bless him. Some things never really change, do they? However, God honors his determination, and he passes Abraham's blessing on to him, and he renames Jacob as Israel, which means wrestles with God. Now, it's this last part of the book, the story of Jacob's sons, where all the themes come to a head. Jacob loves his second to youngest son, Joseph, more than any of the others, and he gives him this special jacket. And the 10 older sons come to hate Joseph, and so they kidnap him, and they plan to kill him, but instead they decide to just sell him into slavery in Egypt, where he ends up in prison. Talk about family failure. But God is with Joseph, and he orchestrates Joseph's release from prison, and Pharaoh ends up elevating Joseph to second in command over all of Egypt. And so Joseph saves the nation of Egypt during a famine. And he also ends up saving his brothers and his family from starving to death. And so once again, we can see the folly and the sin of Abraham's family is met with God's faithfulness, who subverts even the evil of the brothers into an occasion to save life. And this is actually what Joseph says right near the end of the book. He says to his brothers, you all planned this for evil, but God planned it for good, to save many lives. Now, these words are strategically placed at the end of the book because they summarize not only the story of Joseph and his brothers, but the book as a whole. From Genesis 3 onward, humans keep acting selfishly and doing evil, but this God is not going to leave this world to its own devices. He remains faithful and determined to bless people despite their failures. You can see this especially in how that mysterious promise about the descendant of the woman gets developed throughout the book. So remember, Genesis 3, God promised that this wounded victor would come and crush the snake and defeat evil at its source. And the author then connects this promise directly to the line of Abraham. This is a part of how God's going to bring his blessing to the nations. Now from Abraham, this promise gets connected to Judah, the 4th son of Jacob. And this is how. In an extremely important poem in chapter 49, in aging Jacob, he's on his deathbed, he wants to bless his 12 sons. And when he comes to Judah, Jacob predicts that Judah will become the tribe of Israel's royal leaders, and that one day a king will come who will command the obedience of all the nations and fulfill God's promise to restore the garden blessing to all the world. And then after this, Jacob dies. And later, Joseph dies too. And the growing family remains in Egypt. And so the book of Genesis ends with all of these future hopes and promises left hanging and undeveloped. And it forces you to turn the page to see how it's all going to turn out. But for now, that's the book of Genesis.
Amen.
So we end yung chapter 3 natin dito. So,
present sa ito na yung end na Genesis na nag-go. So, do you guys have anything that?
Hindi sinali yung assurance na binitaw ni Joseph bago siya matay. You will carry my bone out of this place. Sa last chapter na.
Pag-tingin sa Exodus, when they moved, when they transferred, when they moved, yung sa Exodus na dinala talaga ni Moses yung kanyang bone.
Yes.
Kasi that was like also a prophecy na talagang
God
they
will
would go back.
Yeah.
That the God would complete His promise.
Yes.
To their family.
Bago namatay si Joseph.
So, we see ano na yung theme ba na men can fail.
Yeah.
But it's really the faithfulness of God that holds it. Amen. From families, individuals, society, amen. Talagang,
Kaya yung palagay mo bakit yung tribes ni Judah ang naging among the 12 tribes? And what's your conclusion to that?
anak siya ni di ba? Anak siya ni Leah.
Pang-apat.
Oo, anak siya ni Leah. Then, ang kanyang meaning na kanyang pangalan is praise.
Praise of God.
This time I will praise Him.
So, yeah. Why do you think? Panganay.
No, rebel ng panganay.
Maybe Jacob was pleased.
Rebel, Simeon, may failure sila. Si Levi, dahil naging so susunod na yun na
Si Judah.
si Judah na.
And Judah too have a history.
He has a failure also.
Yeah, he failed.
Also
like,
marriage.
He has 3 sons. Sarah, hindi binigay sa kanya. Oh, yung youngest, hindi niya binigay kay, Tamar.
Kinana niya yung daughter-in-law
he
niya.
said he slept with her and then when silang anak. Hindi okay. So, he was failed.
Yeah, but pinili siya.
Yeah. So, but, yeah, you're right. God chose him.
God chose whom He
Kasi
wants.
na sa buhay ng tao, God actually has a purpose. Kung we are connected with God when we come to know Jesus, and then there is like a new sense of purpose at least sa buhay natin. Ganun din ito sa kanila because it's not necessary even for the tribe of, sabi natin last time na for Ham, yung Canaanites. Actually, iba, isa din sa inyo yata yung nagbanggit na si, yung soldier ni David. Yung nagbanggit, soldier, asawa ni Bathsheba.
Uriah.
Yeah, he's actually a Canaanite. Yeah, but then, kahit na parang there was a curse, individual people can come out of that. Okay?
Interesting.
Yeah. And then, ganun din si Judah. I mean, he's not clean either. Ganun naman, yung ganun, yung mga situation na yung parang ano ko dun sa Genesis,
The moment they humbled
parang
themselves.
pinipili niya, ito yung pinipili niya na parang balang pinipili. Katulad ng pero sabi niya na naging pinipili siya.
When he
Kasi
humbled
paborito siya niya. Nag-ano siya, napunta siya sa Egypt. But did you also observe na na-carry yung bad traits na si Isaac mayroong favorite at sa nanay niya si Rebecca mayroong favorite, and then he repeated the same mistake sa kanyang mga anak. He also observed favoritism sa kanyang mga anak. And it has already created problems sa kanyang the generation before him. But in somehow we repeated the same mistake.
Meron akong nabasa sabi niya kaya daw meron daw magandang damit na binigay kasi tinahi daw ng mother niya yung particularly sa kanya.
Wala naman na sila.
Oo, wala. Kaya nga binigay. Tinahi daw ng asawa niya. Kaya binigay na lang naman talaga. Hindi naman sure. But of course, walang
Walang
kasi
support.
ganun.
Walang support.
Hindi naman ganun nakalagay sa Bible.
But it's possible na doon mo kita. I don't know, I have not read it. Baka sa, Ino. Lubog Ino. Kasi may mga explanation doon sa mga bagay-bagay na nangyayari na hindi natin nababasa sa Bible. I'm not saying na it's inspired.
Inspired.
But
Canonized.
many things in the book of Enoch is being explained na hindi natin mababasa sa Bible. Although pag binabasa ko sa Bible, pero it explains many things na hindi natin nakukuha dahil para siyang it's a missing link.
Behind the
And then
scenes.
going to the book of Enoch, it explains. So, yeah, so he repeated the same mistake. And actually, ganun din sa pamilya natin. Okay. The sin or mga weaknesses, problems sa ating mga families na hindi sa level ninyo, level ng parents ninyo at mga uncles ninyo. And then, mayroon na kayong nakikita mga problema nila. Somehow, nakikita ninyo sa mga kapatid ninyo among yourself. And then, somehow, makikita din yun sa mga anak ng level ng ako na kibali ng mga magulang. Okay? Kasi, somehow, we repeat the same mistake. Okay? And, yun ang sinasabi nila na sometimes there is a person that needs to be broken sa mga families natin. Especially kung talagang makikita natin na it's a repeat. Gaya ng kung makita ninyo na makita lang yung puro hiwala yung mga level ng mga magulang ninyo or bubuntis bago nag-asawa or ang mga relasyon ay puro yung sa level ng pagkakapatid nila, puro sila broken home. And then, pagdating sa mga cousins na kibali, sila mga unwed, mga single mom. Okay? And then, of course, magtaka ka na doon, magtaka ka na doon sa puso mo na, ayaw ko yun nangyari sa mga anak ko. Kasi siyempre, nakita mo na yun sa level mo, nakita mo na doon sa taas na mga generation niyo. And then, of course, ayaw na yun nangyari sa mga anak niyo. Sa iyo na magsisimula
Yung mama ko is lagi nang question. Kasi yung next ko at saka yung isa, nabuntis na bago ko sinasal, at sinasundan ngayon. Kasi lagi na kina-question, bakit kami ng papa mo hindi naman, yung kumbaga kasal muna bago mo nangyari, pero bakit nagkakaroon? Forever. Ikaw ang magdadala ng hindi, sinagyan ko yung mga kapatid ko, ikaw mag-pray na kahit putol ng verse. Kasi sabi nila, at least may baby. Sabi ko, oo, it's a blessing. Pero i-pray ninyo yung nagkakaroon yung mga kasal kasi parang first yan, parang na dapat maputol na yan, na dapat sa next na mga anak ninyo, yung pagkasama ba, dapat kasama na.
O kasi sa ako na nila yun, ipado na yun sa ako nila na it will be a repeat na mistake. So yeah, that is really like that has to be dealt with bilang Cristiano. Whatever man yung sin ba na parang hindi natin repeated sa buhay ulan natin, mga kasi lulo natin o mga tiya natin, hindi na maulit. Kung nangyayari sa level natin magkakapatid, hindi na mapasa sa mga anak. So one of the things doon ay we need to stand against it. We really have to pray about na the power of the enemy destroying life, destroying families, or breaking marriages, or making mga adulterous relationships, or doing mga abortion, na ganong klase ng mga sin na have to cut the power and stop there. No more. It should not pass over sa mga anak-anak na ninyo.
Kadalasan kasi ngayon, yun yung nangyayari. What other people hate to their parents, they end up doing. Doon sila na, because of hate, interest, kailangan silang ma-orient sa word because just lalong lalala.
Dahil I'm sure na Jacob must have felt the pain na pinigor ni Jacob si Esau. Naunawaan niyo? But somehow, he repeated the same thing. Oo! Di ba he could have already learned na I should not do it sa aking mga anak. I mean, kahit siguro mas closer sa kanya kasi favorite na asawa niya si Rachel. But not that obvious na gawin ng ganung klase. At saka baka naman obedient talaga si Joseph. So, then it made it different.
But if someone is living in sin, it's not yet really connected to God, i-justify niya pa yung ginawa niya na he will say, naunawaan ko bakit ganito ang ginawa ng tatay ko in the past. Those, before, galit na galit siya sa ginawa ng mali ng tatay niya. And then, nung ginawa na niya, i-justify niya, now I understand bakit ganun ang ginawa ng tatay ko. Ganun ang justification ng mga taos living in sin. But, yun lang po ang experience.
Totoo yun. Kasi we know of like, gaya ng mayroong anak na lalaki, and then nakita niya yung gaano na lang ka-violent ang tatay niya sa kanyang nanay. And then, nag-promise siya sa sarili niya na, I think my father forbids violence sa aking mother. I will never do it. Kung ako ay mag-asawa, I will never be violent. Mag-promise siya sa sarili niya. But then, nag-asawa siya. And exactly naging violent din siya sa kanyang asawa. Okay? Na nag-promise naman sana siya dahil nakita nga niya yung suffering ng kanyang nanay. Kung paano na siya suffer. But then, nakita natin doon na at this, kasi the tendencies, kasi pareho naman tayo ng DNA ng ating mga magulang. So, ang kanilang weakness, most likely, may pasa din sa amin. Na kahit na mag-promise tayo, without talaga the power of God, hindi natin yung mag-break. We will do the same thing. Kahit na yung paninigarilyo, pero kami namin, sabihin ito na, talagang nag-promise na, dahil naninigarilyo yung itay, andin siya pa yung nagsisindi ba? Ng pustulo, and then, nagsisigarilyo tatay niya, and then, of course, the cigar, and then, yung pag-iinom. So, nag-promise siya na, pag ako'y lalaki, hindi talaga ako maninigarilyo. Ay, change mover siya, hindi niya mabita-bita ko. Promise na lang siya ng promise na i-break yung wala tayo.
Praise God, sa amin walang sumunod. Tatlo yung mga kapatid ko na nasa walang sumunod sa atin.
Kaya yun din yung replica ng story ni Jacob. Dahil yung kanyang deceiver, he lived with the deceiver of his own children. Imagine after that old age, na dahil napaniwala siya na patay na. It's a shocking na very clearly sinabi ng mga anak niya, patay na si Joseph. I mean, what a very pain na madinig yun, the whole story. Kaya yun ang sukod sa mga anak, yung mga kapatid niya. Huwag na kayo mag-away sa daan. Huwag na kayo. This is all the will of God. I mean, napakahirap. I mean, sometimes we also gotta pay for our own actions later on sa mga sinasabi.
Yeah. Okay, so anyway, I hope na hindi lang ito, we are not only learning about these people, but we can also translate it sa ating mga buhay, sa ating mga sitwasyon ngayon. Kasi kung makita natin ito, God was still working out. Yes. Despite sa ganong failure ng mga tao. Okay? And whatever na nangyayari sa buhay nila, ganoon na rin sa mangyayari sa mga buhay natin. God's purpose is always to redeem him. Always to redeem, even the worst of situation. Amen. Okay? Always to redeem. Alright, so, tayo. Exodus na tayo. Okay.
Asawa ka na rin sa may puti ka na sa buka.
Connection nun. Kailangan bata is so good.
I know.
Kaya,
My God's grace.
papalabas natin yan, ma'am.
Strength yung naman na nag-promise sa sarili.
So after that summary, okay, makita natin after yung summary ng buhay ni Joseph. Now this is, you would remember better. Pag makita natin ito, Joseph in Egypt.
Basta pindot-pindot lang ako.
Ano ba yan? Yung Holy Spirit and things.
Ating kulit ko naman namin. Basta yun lang pipindutin ko lang.
Nagising ka na dyan.
Ay, nakatulog ako. Nakita na ka Late na kayo natapos. What? Dapat inayaan mo.
We're walking through the book of Genesis, which is made up of these two main parts.
And the first part begins in the garden, where we watch humanity spiral downward in self-destruction, and it ends in the Tower of Babel, where a rebellious humanity is scattered by God.
Then the second part of Genesis zooms in and focuses on just one family.
And right in the middle is this story that links the two parts of Genesis together and helps us understand what the whole book is all about.
So how do we get from the Tower of Babel to the story here in the middle?
Well, after the scattering at Babel, there's this genealogy, and it follows one of the tribes all the way down to this one guy named Abram.
You probably know him as Abraham.
And God starts making all these promises to Abraham, like he's going to bless him and give him a ton of kids. And he says that through him and his family, all the nations of the earth are now going to find God's blessing. So basically, God is trying to restore humanity back to the goodness of the garden and to his original intentions for the world. So it's like his rescue plan for humanity. That's why the whole second half of Genesis is about this one family. And so you have Abraham, and then he has a son Isaac, who has Jacob, and then Jacob has 12 sons. And each generation, God renews his promise to bless them and all nations through them.
So because of this promise to use this family to rescue the world, it's pretty easy to read these stories as examples of how to be a good person.
But actually, for the most part, this family is totally dysfunctional. So for example, let's go back to Abraham. This whole story is about God giving him and his wife Sarah a family. But two different times, he basically gives Sarah away to other men by denying that she's even his wife. And then Sarah gets impatient about having a son, and so she makes Abraham sleep with her servant girl, which then causes all of these other problems in the family.
So they get really
Yeah.
Exodus. Overview. Exodus, yeah. Part
Diba?
1. Part 2. Yung ano,
Yung Exodus kay Joseph naman yun. Ay, naman siya yun. That's ang huling portion. Kay Joseph.
Pero may direct naman yan na live sa Facebook.
Sino nakabasa si Kaya na ganyan?
Oo, kasi yan yung
Yan ba yan?
ginagawa ng mga nag-vlog ko.
Ito.
Direct na live sa YouTube.
My spirit of Chinese.
Sa Facebook naman pwedeng direct.
Spirit of Chinese.
On an island just below the first cataract of the Nile, an ancient inscription written around the 4th century BC was found which claimed to be a copy of a document written by Pharaoh Joseph more than 1,000 years earlier. It is the story of a land grant made by the Pharaoh to the priests of the god Num. It tells of 7 years of famine and 7 years of plenty, how Pharaoh had a dream and consulted his chancellor for help. It contains most elements of the 7 years of famine and 7 years of plenty story, although they were corrupted in this account, written over 1,000 years after the event took place. But most importantly, the priests who wrote this inscription were relying upon the land grants made by this Pharaoh to justify their claim to some land. They were not writing what they believed was an ancient myth. They obviously believed the land grants made by Pharaoh Joseph to still be valid and of enough authority to still be in effect well over 1,000 years later. And Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. Only the land of the priests bought he not, for the priests had a portion assigned them of Pharaoh. Ancient Egyptian records list Joseph as the 16th Pharaoh of Egypt, and historians have classified him with the so-called Third Dynasty. His chancellor, named Imhotep, was first known through the writings of the Egyptian historian Manetho, who in the 3rd century BC wrote, "During Joseph's reign there lived a man named Imhotep, who had the reputation of the Greek god of medicine and who invented the art of building with hewn stone." The legends attributed to Imhotep were so incredible that he was considered to be mythical until this century, when excavations at Joseph's pyramid complex revealed the base of a statue with the name Joseph on it and the name Imhotep, with his long list of titles, one of which was chief under the king, a title which first appears with Imhotep and also was first bestowed upon Joseph. Imhotep was also the architect of Pharaoh Joseph's pyramid and surrounding complex, a veritable city within a city of incredible beauty and extremely advanced in design. Built on the plateau of Saqqara, adjacent to ancient Memphis, the pyramid within the complex is the first ever built in Egypt. Ron Wyatt spent a great deal of time here searching for evidence which might shed light on the biblical account. Such an event is the famine described in the story of Joseph, and the distribution of grain to the other countries would have required a major facility and system of organization. When the famine came and Joseph's brothers came from Canaan to get grain from Egypt, we are told that they went to Joseph, which indicates that he personally oversaw the distribution, at least to those coming from foreign countries. And this would mean that there was certainly a central location or granary to which the foreigners came. The complex at Saqqara contains 11 massive pits, which even the Egyptians are at a loss to explain. They are not tombs, for all tombs were underground and carefully sealed, while these were accessible from the surface, and they are extremely large. But most fascinating is the fact that they are all connected by chutes. Ron believes these were the grain storage pits of the 7-year famine. As grain was removed from one pit, grain from the other pits flowed through the chutes, making the grain always accessible from one location. These are within the wall of the step pyramid complex, which has only one entrance, and it opens to a long covered passageway with small cubicles on each side, each just the right size for a person to sit with perhaps a small table. The narrow, singular entrance would have allowed only a few people to enter at a time. There was no doubt in Ron's mind that this was the main center of grain distribution on a massive scale. As people arrived to get their grain, they lined up to enter the long corridor. Inside, they paid one of the cashiers in one of the cubicles for the grain. After payment was made, perhaps they were given a sack for grain which reflected the amount of their payment. Then they proceeded through the corridor straight to the area of the grain bins. Once there, they descended the stairway next to the storage bins, handed their sack to a worker who filled it with grain and returned it to them. Then they exited through a small door on the lower level, which led to the outside of the complex. When the pits were first excavated, bits of grain still remained in them. During the 7-year famine, Egypt gained great wealth and prominence among the nations through the selling of the grain. The Egyptians who lived in their cities along the Nile had little to do during the famine, since they had a 7-year supply of grain to rely on and were able to devote their time to the building projects of the Pharaoh, not as slaves, but as grateful subjects. The family of Jacob, who lived in the Delta, separate from the native population, prospered and grew, exempt from the 1/5 taxation levied on the native population. From the time Jacob's family came to Egypt until the birth of Moses, many pharaohs had come and gone, many ruling contemporaneously with others in different regions. But until now, all recognized the rights granted to the people of Israel to live in the land of Ramses. But that was about to change.
Kasi wala ng record. Actually, when ang Egypt, in-erase nila ang lahat ng record about Moses and about the sa kanilang history. Walang history about kay Moses, walang history about the plain. Okay? Dito lang na mayroon silang sinabing patungkol kay
Joseph.
But then, there is no record na makita patungkol sa kay Moses at saka sa plain. They deleted it in their history. In fact, it's so important. Di ba? Pero wala. Hindi makita doon. So anyway, these are some summary questions we have. What are the 3 promises God said to perform? For Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Life, blessing, and presence. Life, blessing, and presence. Presence with God. 3. Number 9, blessing. Life, blessing, and presence. Okay. Number 2, Psalm. What did Abraham and Sarah do that showed they have been promised to give them a child? Sarah, when she heard the angel saying that she's bearing a child that she loves,
Paggamit nila kay Hagar.
Yeah, they doubted. Because they were all in the old age.
What did he do? What did he do?
They try to help God.
They're getting Hagar in the picture.
Yeah, that's what the other, yeah. They try to work things out. They try to help God somehow fulfill this promise. Number 3, the 3 characteristics in the covenant that made with Abraham. Ano yun?
It's eternal.
It's the answer, the summary question of chapter 3. Ano? Because of everlasting provides the basis
Saan naman pa kasi yun?
characteristic of the covenant of God is everlasting, provides blessing, based on right? That's the characteristic. You guys are answering your books?
Yeah. Dito pala. Yeah.
But then you guys have books. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So now let's go to chapter 4. Okay. Keep answering your books. Keep answering your books. Right? If I have time now. You have to make time. Gusto natin natatapos.
By God's grace,
Right? Now let's go to chapter 4. Okay? So, we divide it again into two. Ang chapter 4 at saka 5 natin dito. Ito yung outline ng Exodus. We're now in the book of Exodus. The first part is when we run from Egypt. And then the covenant, remember chapter 19 and chapter 20 is where the Ten Commandments. The instructions to Moses concerning the tabernacle. Okay? And then they broke, and then they renewed again the covenant. That was like supposed to be, they sinned, remember when they did that
Golden calf.
golden calf, yeah, the golden calf. And then instructions for Moses concerning the tabernacle. Okay? So, yan ang outline. Can somebody read this one? Please, Jackie.
Exodus reveals God's work of redemption and his call to obedience. Although Jesus did not refer directly to the book of Exodus, obviously it played an important part of history of Israel in God's great work of redemption. The book of Exodus continues the story of God's people in Egypt and of God's making for himself a people who would follow him in obedience and faith. The book of Exodus shows how the people of Israel became the people of God. It shows how Israel became a nation.
Okay. So remember, it was just one person and then a family. Now a nation. And it takes many years for the plan of God to materialize. And probably it could have been shorter if people obey. Yes. Okay? Sometimes the process of God will finish would take longer. Tama. Kasi, yeah. Obedience is important. Every blessing comes after. Yes.
Blessing comes after the
Obedience first before
struggle.
the blessings.
Huwag mong
Kasi,
advance.
kung we don't obey, then there needs to be a discipline.
Yan ni Jacob.
And when we're disciplined, then it takes time. That actually, we already learned the lesson right away, but sometimes we have to learn again. Kasi we do not learn the first time. Time it takes more than one time. Right?
One time.
And God is not going to just skip that. And many times in the lessons in life, like for them, it took them 40 years to eventually enter. It wouldn't have taken that long. But because they didn't obey, they didn't have the faith to trust, it took longer than it should. Ganun din yung buhay natin, so we have to be careful.
God allows it din naman para makita nila ba na sa sarili nila na hindi talaga nila kaya by their own strength. Here comes to the point na talaga yung time na nag-rely na sila kay God, doon na nag-work si God. Kasi when, like for example today, when we keep striving by our own performance, by our own effort, God cannot move unless we rely on His goodness, unless we rely on the finished work of Jesus. That's the time God will move and the Holy Spirit will move. Kasi pag nakikita ni God, like Exodus, like people in Exodus and the Israelites, they keep that time when they pass through the Red Sea, they don't see anyone, only God. They focus on the God. They always depend on God. But now when they are in the foot of in the Mount Sinai, they rely on their own strength. They rely on their own ability, knowledge. Now here comes they build by their own. Naggumawa sila ng God, sa sarili nila. They forgot the living God who protect, who take care, who sustain. Yes, when we know food, God protect, God give food. Water, God give, God give, God give. But now they become dependent on their own performance and they disobey God. The disobedience comes when you depend on yourself. The disobedience comes if you rely on your own effort.
Okay.
Wala na magsulat.
Basta na lang.
Exodus 1 to 18.
Mami,
Oh, sorry.
yung Exodus niya, yun na lang.
Pwede, voicemail na lang, ma'am.
Voicemail na lang
Sa mga-
tayo sa mami sa Exodus.
Sabi ko, papi.
Subutin na lang,
No.
pwede.
Summary mo yun, Ken? Ay,
Yung
Quincy.
summary niya sa Exodus, voicemail na lang daw niya.
Yeah.
Sinabi na mo yata yung summary mo.
Kumuha ka na rin.
Genesis yan.
Yan.
Pero nga, hindi mo kasi alam eh. Lagyan mo ng summarize sa copy. Yung lesson learned. Yun man talaga, di ba?
Summary lang man yung nakalagay dun sa...
Summary man sa akin. Kasi sinabi ni Ma'am nung first,
Ang summary lang sa akin.
kasi summary.
Oh, kasi parang yun lang naman nakalagay.
At saka lesson learned.
Meron ba?
Binasa ko summary lang.
Summary lang.
Oo, ako rin. Summary
Pero
lang.
may lesson learned talaga.
Wala sa akin. Summary lang.
Ano ba?
The book of Exodus. It's the second book of the Bible, and it picks up the storyline from the previous book of Genesis, which ended with Abraham's grandson, Jacob, leading his large family of 70 people down to Egypt. Now, Jacob's 11th son, Joseph, had been elevated to second in command over Egypt, and he had saved his whole family. And so Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, offered the family to come live there as a safe haven. And so eventually Jacob dies there in Egypt, and Joseph and all his brothers do too. About 400 years pass, and the story of the Exodus begins. Now that name refers to the event that takes place in the first half of the book, Israel's Exodus from Egypt. But the book has a second half that takes place in the foot of Mount Sinai. In this video, we'll just focus on the first half, where centuries have passed, and the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied.
Si Jacob lang ang living sa Egypt.
Now, this line is a deliberate echo back to the blessing God gave all humanity back in the Garden of Eden. And it reminds us of the big biblical story so far. Humanity forfeited God's blessing through sin and rebellion, and so God chose Abraham's family as the vehicle through which he would restore his blessing to all. But the new Pharaoh does not view Israel as a blessing. He actually thinks this growing Israelite immigrant group is a threat to his power. And so just as in Genesis, humanity rebels against God's blessing, so here, Pharaoh attempts to destroy the source of God's blessing, the Israelites. He brutally enslaves them and forces them, and then he orders that all the Israelite boys be drowned in the Nile. Now Pharaoh, he is the worst character in the Bible so far. His kingdom epitomizes humanity's rebellion against God. Pharaoh has so redefined good and evil according to his own interests that even the murder of innocent children has become good. And so Egypt has become worse than Babylon from the book of Genesis. And so now Israel cries out for help against this new Babylon, and God responds. God first turns Pharaoh's evil upside down as an Israelite mother throws her boy into the Nile River, but in a basket. And so he floats safely right down into Pharaoh's own family. He's named Moses, and he grows up to eventually become the man that God will use to defeat Pharaoh. In the famous story of the burning bush, God appears to Moses and commissions him to go to Pharaoh and order him to release the Israelites. And God says that he knows Pharaoh will resist, and so he will bring his judgment on Egypt in the form of plagues. Then God also says that he will harden Pharaoh's heart. And so we're introduced into the next main part of the story, the confrontation between God and Pharaoh. Now, what does this mean that God says he'll harden Pharaoh's heart? It's super important to read this section of the story really closely and in sequence. In Moses and Pharaoh's first encounter, we're told simply that Pharaoh's heart grew hard. There's no implication that God did anything. And so in response, God sends the first set of 5 plagues, each one confronting Pharaoh and one of his Egyptian gods. And each time, Moses offers a chance for Pharaoh to humble himself and to let the Israelites go. But after each plague, we're told that Pharaoh either hardened his heart or that his heart grew hard. He's doing this of his own will. And so eventually, it's with the second set of 5 plagues that we begin to hear how God. So the point of the story is, even though God knew that Pharaoh would resist his will, God still offered all these chances to do the right thing. But eventually, Pharaoh's evil reaches a point of no return. I mean, even his own advisors think that he has lost his mind. And it's at that point that God takes over and bends Pharaoh's evil towards his own redemptive purposes. God lures Pharaoh into his own destruction as he saves his people, which is what happens next. With the final plague, it's the night of Passover, and God turns the tables on Pharaoh. Just as he killed the sons of the Israelites, so God will kill the firstborn in Egypt with the final plague. But unlike Pharaoh, God provides a means of escape through the blood of the lamb. And here the story stops and introduces us in detail to the annual Israelite ritual, Passover. On the night before Israel left Egypt, they sacrificed a young, spotless lamb and painted its blood on the doorframe of their house. And when the divine plague came over Egypt, the houses covered with the blood of the lamb were passed over, and the sons spared. And so every year since, the Israelites have reenacted that night to remember and to celebrate God's justice and mercy. But Pharaoh, because of his pride and rebellion, he loses his own son. And he's compelled to finally let the Israelites go free. And so the Israelite slaves make their exodus from Egypt. But no sooner do they leave than Pharaoh changes his mind. And he gathers his army and chases after the Israelites for a final showdown. As the Israelites pass through the waters of the sea safely, Pharaoh charges towards his own destruction. The Exodus story concludes with the first song of praise in the Bible. It's called the Song of the City. And the final line declares that the Lord reigns as king. And then the song retells in poetry what the story of God's kingdom is all about. It's about how God is on a mission to confront evil in his world and to redeem those who are enslaved to evil. God is going to bring his people into the promised land where his divine presence will live among them. This story is what it looks like when God becomes king over his people. So after the Israelites sing their song, the story takes a sharp turn. The Israelites are trekking through the wilderness on their way to Mount Sinai, and they're hungry, they're thirsty, and they start criticizing Moses and God for even rescuing them. They say they long for the good old days in Egypt. It's crazy. So God graciously provides food and water for Israel in the wilderness, but these stories, they cast a dark shadow. And we begin to wonder, could it be that Israel's heart is just as hard as Pharaoh's? We shall see. But for now, that's the first half of the book of Exodus.
Hindi mo uwi, diretso yun sa
Okay. So,
Saan? May sinasabi ata si Ate Jess. Baka may tanong. Oh.
okay. So, alam natin yung nangyari sa Exodus 1 and 2. Okay. Now, let's move on sa 3 hanggang 9. This is where, remember, Moses was rescued as a baby, and then he grew up in Pharaoh's court, and then we saw someone, they were fighting, an Egyptian being tormenting or Moses Hebrew Israelite, and so he got in the middle of that, and then saved the Egyptian. Okay, and then the next day, Moses killed. Nag-awal na naman ang magkaparehong Hebrew people, and then sabi na, yung people doon nila. So, natapos siya doon, pinanaway. Okay, so, then, he went to Midian. Okay, and then that is when he encountered God. Okay, so, all of this, kita natin sa kay Abraham, kita natin kay Jacob, they all encountered God.
Okay, and now again, Moses. And every time na there is this encounter with God, then he changes the whole story ng buhay ng tao.
Yes.
Okay, and so I hope na sa ating din mga buhay, we encounter God, and it has made a shift sa mga buhay natin. The direction, meaning, the purpose, the reason why we're here. We have an eternal purpose na, hindi na gaya sa dati. Right? So, okay. Now, let's go sa mga excuses ni Moses. Okay? Because this is very difficult and it has this in our book. So, the first excuse na kinausap ka ng Panginoon was to go to Egypt kasi God has heard. Actually, it's really cool na ang sinabi dito na na God heard their suffering. He saw. Okay? And then God hears of these people. Okay? And so in the first excuse in Moses, how did God respond? Kasi in the encounter right now when he was told to do something. Huh?
God showed him his stuff. Yung hawak niyang baton. Baton.
Yan, ang una niyang excuse is I'm not worthy. Why do you think he thinks he wasn't worthy? It's not able to.
He can speak well.
He killed someone.
It's not worthy. It's in your book. Look at page
He said, I will be with you.
so 72. Okay? That was his first excuse. Well,
God said, I will be with you.
what was the word na he used? Na nagsasabi dito na he did not feel worthy. What did he say? What's the word that he used? Ni Moses.
Who am
Oh,
I?
my,
Yes. Who am I?
Jackie Chan.
Who am I? That's the question he asked God. Who am I? Why do you think he feels unworthy?
Because he knows who he is. He's looking at himself. He's not looking at the God.
Yeah. And then what did he say when he looked at himself?
His unworthiness, his sins, his failures.
Yung weak, nakita niya yung weakness. What was his weakness?
He is not articulate.
Yeah.
Hindi siya magaling. Oh.
He was running away. And so, he just killed someone.
Very guilty. Guilt.
Okay, so he knew that I just killed someone. I mean, God must have known. And then he also have a problem with anger. I don't
But it's been 40 years. I mean, all
Maybe
the
may depression
skill
din.
na-experience niya, the loneliness is
Yan,
down.
hindi niya na-realize.
Too much already. I mean, all of that has been drained out already. It's past all of that.
Oh.
Lalabanan niya ang pero with all of that, I mean, it's not, I'm not that guy.
Yeah, the challenge that is ahead of him and like the task that is asked by God for him to do is today.
Yeah.
Okay? It's today. And plus,
Answer niya.
yeah, if we look at himself, I can do it. We move on. Okay? And his, we can really hear that he hasn't really settled his past yet. Okay? And that's why in the New Testament, when we go to the New Testament, what did Jesus say about evil?
In your anger, do not sin.
Yeah, in your anger, do not sin. And then also,
Do not let the sun go down while you are angry.
yeah, and also Jesus said that if we are angry for our brother,
Go
go reconcile first before offering.
Give your offering.
It's just like we have healed.
Or
Okay?
anyone who
You've heard.
hates his brother
Sabi ni
is a
Jesus that
murderer.
I say. Alright? That being angry or brother, just like me. And usually anger can be the person.
Next ko sa cards.
I love you with the
Or
Lord.
okay. Di ba? God has warned him like, why are you angry? Why is your anger so down? Because his anger actually caused him to feel evil. Okay? So, nakikita natin yan. Who am I? So, this is an issue of his identity. He felt inadequate for the task. Too big. But again, he mentioned that he's looking at himself, he's not looking at God. So, what was God's answer?
I will be with you.
How will it be different?
When we sense that God is with us, and when he knew that God is with him, he became confident to do. He accepted the task because he had
So,
this.
yeah, so the solution of our unworthiness is
God's worthiness.
yeah, God himself.
Yeah, I am one.
Yeah, I am with you. That's the promise. Right? So, and then
I am
how
worthy.
about oh, and then there was even God has to give him a sign. Again, nakita na naman natin, hindi nilibig ni God si Moses. Okay? So, there are times na God really knows our weaknesses. He knows our inadequacies that kung gaya ng kay Jacob, nakipag-bargain pa siya, okay, nakipag-negotiate, God didn't believe him. Because God knows where we are in our faith, in our experience, in our knowledge, and God usually, would deal with us according to where we are. Mas gracious pa nga si God sometimes than our leaders, ating mga early leaders. Yung expectation nila ang taas-taas na kung hindi natin maiimit, wala na agad tayo. But yet at the same time, we need to reach him out like what God is doing. He's trying to reach out. He's not just giving up. Dahil ganito, nagmagawa sila ng excuses and then give up na lang agad. God still trying to reach out even then to the level. What was the second excuse? I don't know enough about God. So what was God's answer dito? Sa cards. So Moses is saying, I don't even know. You're sending me, but I don't know you. Remember, this is your first encounter. I don't know you.
What is your name?
So,
That's just I am who I am.
then now, what God did is He revealed who He is. So can you just see how gracious God is for everyone for all of these people? This is the kind of God we have. Amen. This is the kind of God we have. So He revealed Himself, who He is. And ito na yon ang He revealed that He's Yahweh, the self-existing one, Jehovah. And sabi niya na I am who I am. So, ang kanyang excuse is, but I don't know you. And then God revealed Himself. You help Moses.
I think I like the story of how God shared this revelation. He's the God of Abraham, which is very well known for the Israelite, the Hebrew, the God of Isaac and Jacob. With all these patriarchal people, the main guy, I am their God, I am the one who spoke to them. I am speaking to you. they have a big God for him, is giving him an open door for the challenge him.
Yeah, sometimes, because the future is unknown, okay, for us. Yeah. So God would usually help us to know, to trust Him for the future by basing of what He has been or what He has done in the
In the
past.
past, correct.
Okay? So He helped them understand because I'm sure they know the story, where they came from. They must have known the story of God's promise to Abraham. And so God used that to remind them that what's the point? I am the same God that you guys are talking about. I'm just here to fulfill what I have promised.
Kaso nga lang, mahirap ma'am kasi magaling sila eh. Sila yun eh. Hindi ako yun.
Yeah, that's actually the next excuse. One of these excuses. Okay, so,
Send somebody else.
and remember, nang pinakilala ni God ang kung sino siya, he says, I am who I am. Okay? And remember from where Moses came from, in Egypt, ang exposure niya ay many gods. Okay, to many gods, that was the name. Yung paglaro niya, yun ang nakikita niya lagi, dami-dami mga gods. But this time, God says, I am one. I am. Alright? And in that also like the, pag sabi niya, I am who I am, it means self-existing one or self-sufficient one. And in fact, ang God sa Egypt where Moses came from, they have many, many names. This one is very, very specific. And then, underline ko dito na nagsabi dito ang author natin na the faithful God that I have been in the past, I always will be in the future. So makita natin dito yung kanyang eternal power, unchangeable character, and especially in our changing world. All right, and then would somebody want to share? Yan sa number 73, it says, take time now to list things you know God has done in the past to guide, protect, and bless you and the people you know. Somebody want to share? Sagot nila, area na yun. Page 73, yung pinaka-bottom. What is your answer? Huh?
Sige, Cords.
Anybody?
Take time.
Take time pa daw.
Take time pa man sa namin, ma'am. Wala Sure.
My answer is, take time now to list things so God has done in the past, right? Protect and bless you and the people you know. God set me apart here in Hong Kong. He taught me about who He is and who really He is, and He saved me and His family. He is with me, changed, and He's changed me and He's changing me. He guides me to Himself. He blesses me so much that I could not imagine. He made me His servant by that.
Amen.
Yeah. Anybody else want to share their answer?
For me, Mom, is God guides me, protect me, and bless me. Like pinang kay ate, when God brought me here, though I don't want.
Okay,
Kind of
from Hong Kong, I think most of us can identify.
Yeah.
Okay? Hong Kong has been a blessing to us.
It becomes a blessing because I've become saved here, and God brought people in my life that helps me to grow, and also It protects me because my mindset before is this will be just my specs. Hong Kong will just this stepping stone for a brighter future in other place. But God taught me that in Hong Kong, I found God as my foundation stone. And it changed my perspective about life and blessings. And now I learned my purpose. Before I don't know, my purpose is carnal, I mean about worldly. But now I have an eternal purpose. And it blesses me and my family because I can share my faith to them. And then they saw the changes and seeing the changes na ginagawa ng Panginoon sa akin.
Copy paste, ma'am. You can also see the pattern that God does. I do know there are different people.
Why you have to
In the Old
catfish?
Testament, makita ninyo si Abraham, makita ninyo si Joseph, makita ninyo si Jacob, makita ninyo si Moses. Usually, you know what God does?
Takes you off from your
These
comfort zone.
people, He takes us out of our place and take us somewhere else. And that is a blessing in itself because God could fulfill His purpose for us when we are in other places. We may go back, but yet in the process, He takes us out from where we are, a place of comfort, security, and take us somewhere else where many of us can know Jesus here. Okay? And that's exactly what He does. And even Jesus said, like a prophet has no honor in his own place.
Yeah.
Okay? So there is that. He's taking you here. And He wants to bless you here. Spiritual blessing, material blessing, opportunities to grow, opportunities to serve, opportunities to develop, opportunities to have those qualities that you can only have because you are here. You cannot grow in those areas of your life if you're back in the Philippines. God has to take you away from your family to develop those qualities. And in fact, Jesus Himself has to leave His Father. And the plan, His plan, was only accomplished when He was away. For your life too. God has to take you away. Because He has a better plan. His blessings will only come when you are in the place where you should be. Blessings cannot come when you are not in the right place. Right place for you. Amen. Morning. So you have to go. That's why go where He wants you to go, because that's where the blessing. Even though it's difficult, but the blessing will come when you are in His right place.
Amen.
So yeah, many of us actually, all of us, Hong Kong is the place where God knows that this is the place where we can grow, where we can meet Him and develop our relationship with Him. And of course, we're going to go back. But yet, we have already built or collected or put in our like that. Our heart, our lives is like a treasure. We have already put in treasures that we can only gain, we can only have there in Hong Kong. I'm not even talking about material things today. Material things will last. Amen. Oh, I only have 3 more minutes. Anyway, we'll continue next week. Okay?
Yes.
And then, do you guys have any questions or anything you'd like to share before we begin?
God asked to do an impossible task. It means to be possible, and only us giving tons of excuses not to respond with much, it should be easy. It should be everything should be already a plan, but we make our own different parts of journey. Well, in the end, we are gonna go back to that main purpose of God, because He's the ultimate one. And sad to say, we should not be, as we make our turn to the left or right, we should be, secure of our salvation. Otherwise, we turn more farther away from Him. And that Pharaoh's heart become harder because we choose and wishes of our own stupidity, of our own actions.
Yeah, harder na yung heart niya. And then he heard it more. Kinonfirm lang ni Lord actually yung kanyang decision na yung status ng kanyang puso. Right? Kinonfirm lang because it was already hardened. And then God just confirmed it. Like, because you hardened your heart, then you will continue to harden your heart. It's just confirmed. But like if our heart is also soft and tender towards God, then He will also confirm that we have that kind of heart. Okay? Yeah, I mean, I hope na sa pag-aaral natin ito, we're not only gaining knowledge about
I experience also
Old Testament, but you are gaining a view of God, of who God is, and that will build your relationship sa Kanya. See?
Yeah, I also experienced that hardening of heart. I've been there one time, not one time, ilang beses na siguro. Because it's really hard to i-move away mo yung sarili mo. Yung nakasanayan mo. I've been using drugs, I've been using cigarettes. Lahat ng bagay na nagsasatisfy sa sarili mo. So, it's really hard to let go of those things. So, nung naging born again ako, I experienced the goodness of the Lord. Bumalik na naman ako. So, I try to, hindi ikaw. Bumalik ako ba? Kasi yung heart ko parang nandun talaga sa ano. Pero when you experience really the goodness of God, talagang may changes sa puso. So, I keep coming back to God. Keep coming back. Every time I fail, I keep coming back. Until now, nandito ako because of His mercy. If God's mercy did not come upon me, wala ako ngayon.
Praise God. Yeah. It must have been a long journey. Kaya kaya siguro nang pinagbago mo kung tingnan lang where you have been.
Yeah.
And of course, many of us, it's been a long journey, and we're grateful to God where we are right now.
Long journey,
Opportunity,
still
Long and winding road.
long journey to go.
and faith in trusting God. Okay? So, all right, let's close it prayer now. Father, we thank you, God, so much for showing us how you have dealt people in the past and how you have been so gracious and faithful.